Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Nanette, thank you so much for being part of our exhibition, Return to a Place by the Sea. And as you well know, this exhibition revisits the 1999 exhibition, A Place by the Sea. Here we have 2 works of yours from the 1990s and 2 more recent work. And I'd like to ask how you feel about seeing these 2 bodies of work together.
Very exciting. I have to tell you, around 1996, I started to work on Mylar, this wonderful plastic surface. And this was the first real serious series that I created on that surface from 1999. I stopped working on canvas and paper. I just fell in love with Mylar, which I discovered the architects had been using since the 50s. And so it's interesting to see what I was doing on the surface of the Mylar, what was happening then and what I'm doing now. I've become much more experimental. I've had time to really figure out what I can and cannot do on this surface. And so the more recent pieces, I think you'll see quite a few textural elements that I had not employed at that point. I think that the work in areas have become more painterly. In fact, the 2 pieces that you have here from 1999 from the series Slightly Off Keel actually have woodcut prints. And then I'm painting and all with that, but large woodcut prints. And early on, I was only printmaking on the Mylar. And it wasn't until I really got a chance to experiment on the surface over the years that I really then began to enjoy just painting on it. I love the surface and the smooth quality of the brush. It's just this wonderful feeling, even drawing on it with pencil or color pencil is just wonderful. So I have abandoned canvas and paper totally. And again, this was the first series, Slightly Off Keel. There are 107 works in the series, small and large. And the series that's behind me right now that I've just sort of completed is actually called Cantilever. There's 62 works in that series. So once I come upon a series and an idea, I'd love to be able to just flush out all my ideas around that topic. And in fact, I'm right now, working on 2 new series on Mylar as we speak.
It would seem, looking at your work from the 90s and the more recent work, that there's a greater immediacy to the more contemporary work. They're larger, they're directly on the wall. Can you talk about how you sort of got to that stage?
Yeah. One of my mentors, actually I should say, I'm sorry, 2 of my mentors are in this show. And as you know, I am a collage artist. That's one of the things that I've been focused on now for most of my career. And one of the early collage artists that I saw and really got to know was Frank Wimberley, who's in the show. In fact, I saw a show that was curated by Jim Wilson of Frank's collages, not his paintings, but just his collages. And I'll never forget that show because it was revelatory for me. It was just like, oh my gosh, what is going on here, what he was doing with edges. One of the things that I love about collage is this actual physicality, and so you're seeing the edge of the paper or the edge of the Mylar. And I love that physical quality, and he was just pushing it, and it was just a stunning show. So, seeing his work, but then seeing Al Loving, who I also met out here in the Hamptons, and he was doing these shaped pieces, and he was using corrugated cardboard, painting on it, putting some kind of plastic surface so that cardboard would be stiff, but just dealing with the shape, getting away from the square and the rectangle, and working just with this shape, these wonderful forms. And he's a colorist also. The way he weaves the colors is just incredible. So I remember, of course, seeing his work over the years, seeing Al's work, and knowing how tough the Mylar is. Again, this is plastic, it's going nowhere, okay? I figured it would be really interesting for me to do these shapes and have them directly on the wall. In fact, my first series where I was working in this fashion was called Bouquet for Loving. And I was paying homage to my mentor, Al Loving, and his shapes. And these bouquets, they're real funky flowers. They're crazy. They're flowers you've never seen before. But I started with those. And then when I went on to this series, Cantilevered, I just felt like I wanted to maintain these shapes and to get away from this other platform that's just so classical, the square, the rectangle, you know. Let's just go right straight to the meat of it. And so just really excited about working with these pieces, putting them directly on the wall. There's no frame, there's nothing that gets in the way. The immediacy of that is what really gets me excited. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what drew you specifically to abstraction early in your career, and how your relationship to it has changed over time?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I've got so many stories around that, but I could say that the first time that I worked in an abstract vein was probably when I was 10 years old, and I didn't realize it. And it was actually, these were works that were geometric abstractions. And at the time, I didn't know the term. I was just doing these works on what was really stationery paper. My mother had bought me stationery paper, hoping that I would have my thank you notes written out to people who sent me, you know, gifts or had done something for me. And of course, I loved the paper. It was this, there were different color papers, you know. And so I began to cut up these papers in these geometric shapes and collaging them together. Now, again, I'm about 10 years old. And I think it was probably soon after that that I began to see Romare Bearden's work, another collagist. And then around 13 or so, I meet Frank Wimberley and his collages. And then when I'm in graduate school, I meet Al Loving, and I'm seeing his collages, and I'm just, and abstract art, okay. But then I've got to go back to graduate school, because again, when I was 8, 9, and 10 and doing these collages, I didn't know what I was doing. But it was in graduate school after, of course, you know, you're dealing with the figure and landscape and what have you. I started to do these nighttime scenes of trees. The night light, man-made light, and almost this silhouette of the trees. And there was something about these naked branches in the winter that was just so beautiful. There was this sort of frenetic energy of the branches, but there was also this kind of tension that I enjoyed, but of course just beautiful. And it was from those branches that I began to get more involved with abstract art. Mondrian did the same thing. It was real, and it was trees in particular, and I remember going to see the Mondrian show at the Guggenheim. I'm telling you, there's so many stories that get involved with this and how I got into abstraction. I'll never forget, as a child of 16, 17, high school, going to see this Mondrian show with my class in the Guggenheim, and it's his retrospective. So you're starting with his landscapes, and as you walk around this amazing piece of sculpture that you're inside of, there is this sense of time as you're walking around and him changing, and you see the development of his landscapes, and then his focus on trees and the limbs and the abstraction of, and then all the way down to this minimal, you know, boogie woogie stuff he was doing around New York City, and also dealing with sound and jazz. He loved jazz. So all of this really gave me this sense that there was this wonderful world that people were creating. It was very inventive. Everyone had their own kind of niche, but it was a different world. And I think that's what's so exciting about abstract art. You know, you think of Sam Gilliam as opposed to Willem de Kooning, as opposed to Norman Lewis. Everyone, abstraction, but so very unique in these other worlds. And I wanted to build my world. I wanted to develop a new world as such, you know, working with forms, line, color, texture. Yeah.
Nanette, that we're very excited about for this show is a reinvestigation of the history of abstract painting here on the East End. I think the East End tends to be more associated with the abstract expressionists, but obviously there was this extraordinary vibrant group of African American abstract painters. Could you talk a little bit about that and what it was like to be part of that group at such a seminal time?
Yeah, it was segregated. We had our group, and I have to tell you, we were exhibiting, and there were lulls. I can recall sitting around and lamenting the fact that we weren't showing. When I say we, I'm talking about Al Loving and Frank. You know, we would always kind of, you know, of course, misery loves company. We would all talk about, you know, the issues of not being invited into some of these larger thematic shows dealing with abstraction. But on the other hand, we had African American galleries and institutions that were showing us. Not so many in New York City, I must say. We had the Studio Museum, Cinque Gallery, but we also had a gallery out in Detroit that was showing our work and selling it to African American community. And even out here, you know, Sag Harbor every year would have a big sale for the Cinque Gallery, which was a not-for-profit space. This is a space that was started by Romare Bearden and Ernie Critchlow and Norman Lewis. And so, you know, Norman Lewis being an abstract artist, but you know, everyone would show in this. We had figurative artists who were showing to raise money for Cinque, and we would have it in people's backyards in Sag Harbor and Nineveh. And those were a lot of fun too, and people would come and buy, you know. So we had our own thing. And then I know we also had a couple of fundraisers for the Bridgehampton Daycare Center, which at the time was really working primarily with the black community in Bridgehampton. And these were workers who either worked on the potato farms, back then we had duck farms, or working in the mansions, or landscaping. And it was a very poor community. So the daycare center was a great place for their children to come, especially in the summer, to have activities. There was a little library for reading. We had what was probably the second show. I was not involved with the first show. I think my parents hadn't moved out here at the time, or we hadn't settled. But the second show that we had in someone's home, it was Dick Clark, and Richard Clark was on the board of the NEA, he was on the board of the Studio Museum, and actually was also, towards the end of his life, on the board of the Metropolitan Museum. So he was a collector, and he had collected a lot of Romare Bearden's works. And he had a gorgeous home right there on the bay in Sag Harbor. Actually, I'm sorry, he was in Nineveh. And he allowed us to put our works on his walls. We would put holes in the walls, and he was fine with it. We would hang the show there. And I recall Al being in that show. We invited another artist, Bill Hudson. Frank Wimberley was in the show, Donna Marie Barnes. It was just a bunch of folks. It was wonderful. And we sold pieces basically to the African American community out here. And I think it was something like, you know, 50% went to the artists, 50% went to the Bridgehampton Daycare Center. And it was from that show that Elaine Benson, who was out here in Bridgehampton, Elaine Benson came to that show because she knew Richard Clark. And luckily, from that show, she chose Al Loving, Roz Letcher, wonderful painter, figurative painter, and myself for a show at her gallery in Bridgehampton. I believe this was the second time she had had African-American artists there. I think the first artist was this artist, Harlan Jackson, who was in East Hampton. I believe she showed him first. But the three of us had this show at Elaine Benson, I'll never forget it. Went well, we sold a few pieces. But that I know of, I believe this was the early part of folks looking at our community and some of the artists there. And this was around 1978, because it was soon after that, I think, because of that show. Al Loving was asked to curate a show at Guildhall of the Eastville artists, and that was 1979. And the show was in the fall, so it was hard to get folks out. At that time, too, people didn't come out in the fall and winter as they do now. People literally closed up their homes. A lot of the homes were not really set for winter, you know. And, but those were sort of the beginnings for the Hamptons to begin to see what was going on in this community, this vibrant community. And again, we were kind of helping our own folks, you know, again, Cinque Gallery, fundraisers, and the Bridgehampton Daycare Center. Everyone, you know, we knew each other. We were working together and teaming up and helping all these different not-for-profits. It was an exciting time, you know, it was good.
Politics and social issues remain something that is central to your work. Could you talk a little bit about that? Perhaps the piece that is behind you on the wall might be a good place to start in that discussion.
With the weight, and that's what this series is coming from, and the reason why you'll know it's a part of that series is because I always have these legs at the farthest end of the piece. And you'll notice that some of these lines and areas begin to sink low and then come back up. And so there is this sense of a weightiness and maybe even some sort of a geographical sort of happening that's happening. We're going below ground, you know. The weight was started around the time that Obama was in office. I'd say probably towards the end of his 8 years in office. And I just felt like, even then, just this weight of history. Again, our first African-American president, and he was just as clean as the driven snow. I mean, his children were great. There was no controversy in that office. You know, he was a good person. His wife was brilliant, or is brilliant. Michelle is just a powerhouse. But then I was always, of course, considering folks that were really playing against that whole time period. You know, there were people who were trying to bring Michelle Obama down. And of course, the weight of history and just how black folks have been treated during the course of their, you know, living here 200, 300 years. Well, slavery went on for 246 years. That's a part of this history. That's the part of this country's history. And now, of course, we have governors and people wanting to take that out of the classroom. That's a part of our history. We enslaved people here, you know. So it was about that kind of weight, African Americans having to bear that weight for so long. And I can recall in the 60s, someone told Martin Luther King, well, just wait a while. Wait your time. Wait your time. We've been here. What are you talking about time? We helped to build this country, you know, off our backs, free labor. What are you talking about? Wait for what? So all of that, I just wanted to kind of have that flavor. Now, the work is abstract. If someone comes to this work and sees something else, I'm fine. If someone's using their imagination and they see something else, wonderful. I love it. But this is information many times that I need, that really propels me in the studio. I kind of like to wrap myself around these themes. And it's what really gets me going. It gets me up in the morning to get in the studio. I am a morning person now. I used to be nocturnal when I was younger. I love working in the morning. I read my New York Times first. I have it delivered. I like the analog. I like to hold it. I like the physicality of it. And then I have my coffee and I go into the studio. And these things that I'm reading, I'm sure, are laboring into my mind. They've become infused in all my being, and I just have to let it out. And so I work in a series, and it just something hits me at the time where I'm thinking, okay, I'm ready to go on to another series. I don't know what it is, just something comes across that, okay, I'm done with this. I'm ready to move on. And that's the way I've been creating now for the last 40-some years or more.
One of the things that Jim Wilson celebrated in his writing around his show was the idea of friendship, camaraderie, and an idea of mentorship between the four of you. And I think now, as we kind of end the conversation, I would love for you to reflect on that moment, what those relationships meant at the time, what they mean now, and what they mean now, especially given that the art world is starting to wake up and take notice of your work, and give your work the recognition that it has so richly deserved for so long.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Yeah, you know, it's funny because we were talking about this earlier with Eric Fischel, this sense of a continuum, and I think Al understood this. Al was a teacher. He was a consummate teacher. And he loved, you know, he was gracious. He was very giving of his information and his knowledge. He loved talking to people. He loved helping people. He loved networking. I think that it was clear to Al and to Frank Wimberley that it was important to recognize the younger folks and to help us out, give us a sense of what it's like, you know, the difficulties, the business side of it, the things to do, not to do. All that was so helpful. And I've been a teacher for 20 years. I have just retired from Pratt. And I really feel that as a teacher, I wanted to do the same thing, for students to understand the history, what's come before them, so that they have a sense of where they can go. I feel that this exchange that we had in this community, and it was even larger than the, you know, Hampton area, because we all went back in the winter to New York City. And there was a larger community that we were involved with there also. And so the exchange of, you know, grants that are coming up, what's happening. Al would talk to me about my work. You know, he always felt that, you know, the materiality was always important. Really investigate, experiment. That's something I would tell my students also. Experimentation for artists is very important. That's where you begin to really build your own kind of lexicon and language and vocabulary. And this is what I learned from, you know, not just talking to these people, but looking at Frank's work, going to his home and seeing his art on the walls was a lesson in itself. He didn't have to say anything, just walking around and looking, because that's the language we talk in. It's this visual language was so rich. And I understood how far I could push things, because, for instance, someone like Frank Wimberley, who does do just collages, but when you look at his paintings, he's putting things in those paintings too. He's putting paper in there, he's putting canvas, he's collaging, painting over top of it. Sometimes it's hard to see these things. But when you come in close, you know, you see the richness of those surfaces. And all of that really just excited me to the point where I became very concerned with surface. And so when you see my work, I think you'll see, especially these recent pieces, I think you'll see surfaces you've never seen before, okay? I have created, and I tell no one my recipes. I have special ways of doing these things. But anyway, I just, you know, I have to tip my hat off to these folks who really were integral in my growth.
Nanette Carter, thank you so much.
Good to be here. Thank you, Sarah. All right. Okay.